Paris, the 21st of December, 1928. A man lies dying in an apartment not far from the theatre that carries a name that is not, technically, his own. He is 1 day away from his 64th birthday. He will not see it. The papers, when they notice at all, will identify him the same way they have identified him for 63 years, as a son. Now go back to a small apartment on a Paris side street 4 years before he was even old enough to remember it clearly, where a fire is tearing through the only home he has ever known, and a 24-year-old woman is running into the smoke, past silk, past jewels, past everything she owns, for one reason only: him. How does a boy who was the single thing his mother ever risked her own life to save end up dying in the shadow of her name, half remembered, largely unmourned, while she remains, a century later, the most famous actress who ever lived? His name was Maurice Bernhardt. In the next few minutes, you will learn about a fire in 1868 that destroyed everything his mother owned except him. You will learn about a Polish princess named Teresa Jablonowska, who married him, gave him 2 daughters, and died young in 1910. And you will learn about a single year in which he did not speak to the most celebrated woman in France over the fate of a Jewish army officer named Alfred Dreyfus. What you are about to hear is not a story about the son of a superstar. It is a story about what it costs to be somebody's greatest, most devoted creation, and never quite her equal. There is one detail worth holding on to from the very beginning. His mother kept his hair long and dressed him in fine, almost ornamental clothing, well past the age when other boys had been sent off in plain trousers to be forgotten. She was still dressing him, in her way, when he took his final breath. Stay with this. It has not been told quite this way before. He was born on the 22nd of December, 1864, in Paris's 8th arrondissement, to a 20-year-old actress who had not yet become the woman the world would one day call divine. His mother was Sarah Bernhardt, still years from stardom, working small parts and living off the generosity of protectors. His father was a Belgian aristocrat, Henri, Prince de Ligne, 11 years his mother's senior and already notorious in society circles. The prince's family would not permit a marriage to an unmarried actress of uncertain paternity herself. Some accounts claim he tried to fight for the relationship. Others say he simply disappeared. What is not disputed is the outcome. The boy would grow up with a title of nobility running through his blood and none of its privileges attached to his name. Sarah did not hide him, as so many women in her position might have. She kept him close, took him to rehearsals, dressed him in fine clothing, and let Paris see exactly who he was. Much of his early care fell to Madame Guérard, her lifelong friend and assistant, a steady presence in a household otherwise defined by chaos, debt, and reinvention. Then, in 1868, disaster. A fire tore through the family's Paris apartment, destroying every possession Sarah owned: her furniture, her jewelry, her small fortune of sentimental and financial value alike. She had, at the time, neglected to purchase insurance, but when the flames broke out, witnesses would later recall, she went back in, not for the jewels, not for the silk, for her son. It is the only thing she saved. Consider what that single fact would come to mean over the following 60 years. A boy who learned, before he could likely form the memory consciously, that he was worth more to his mother than everything else she had built. It is a beautiful thing to be loved that fiercely. It is also, quietly, a dangerous inheritance, because a child who has been proven, in the most dramatic way imaginable, to be irreplaceable, rarely learns what it feels like to be responsible for himself. There is another small detail buried in the record. His name Maurice, was not chosen for a father, a saint, or a king. It came from his maternal grandfather, Maurice Bernhardt, an itinerant Dutch Jewish eyeglass peddler Sarah likely barely knew. Even his own name was borrowed from a stranger. What he was not given, in those early years, was ordinary. Not a settled father, not an unremarkable childhood, not the freedom, later, to simply fail and recover the way other young men might. Every safety net that surrounded him would come from one source, and one source only. By 1882, that boy was 18 years old, and his mother was about to hand him something no 18-year-old with no experience should have been given. By the early 1880s, Sarah Bernhardt was no longer a struggling actress fighting for bit parts. She was, by most accounts, the most famous woman on either side of the Atlantic. She had toured America to sold-out houses, returned home with a trunk containing $194,000 in gold coin, been received by Queen Victoria, Tsar Alexander III, and the Emperor of Austria, and commissioned posters from a then-unknown artist named Alphonse Mucha that would define an entire visual era. Maurice, at 18, stood in the glow of all of it. In 1882, newly married to the Greek actor Aristide Demala, Sarah leased and lavishly refurbished a Paris theatre, the Ambigu, specifically to showcase her new husband. And in an act of maternal confidence that history would judge harshly, she made her teenage son Maurice, with no business training, no theatrical management experience, and, by his own family's later admission, little natural discipline, the director. For a moment, it must have felt like everything. A young man barely out of adolescence, suddenly the head of a Parisian theatre bearing his mother's reputation, moving in rooms filled with playwrights, financiers, and the artistic elite of the age. Everything. Then came the fall, and it came quickly. The theatre's centerpiece production, Fedora, opened in December of 1882. It ran for only 50 performances. It lost 400,000 francs, a catastrophic sum, even for a woman as wealthy as Sarah Bernhardt had become. The Ambigu had to be abandoned. Within months, she was forced to sell her jewellery, her carriages, and her horses at public auction to cover the wreckage. There was, buried in that collapse, a detail almost no one paused to examine at the time. The show that ruined the Ambigu was chosen not for its artistic merit, but to give a leading role to Sarah's new husband, a man already sliding toward the morphine addiction that would eventually kill him. Maurice had not chosen the play. He had not chosen the marriage. He had simply been handed the wreckage and told to manage it. Within 2 years, something else would begin to change. Something quieter, harder to see from the outside, developing behind the closed doors of casinos and card rooms across Paris. Before we go any further, you need to understand one thing about Maurice Bernhardt. The debts were never a single event. They were a current, running beneath his entire adult life, and almost everyone close to him knew it, even as the public record stayed relatively quiet. He gambled. Cards, casinos, wages of a kind that could swallow a fortune in a single evening. Biographers who studied the family's private papers describe it plainly. Gambling was, alongside fencing, one of his 2 great passions as he grew older, and it was the one that nearly ruined him again and again. Why hide it when his own mother was famous for scandal, for balloon flights over Paris, for sleeping in a coffin, for keeping a menagerie that included a cheetah, a puma, and an alligator fed on milk and champagne? Because Sarah's scandals built her brand. Maurice's debts only diminished his credibility as a man capable of running anything at all, and by the 1890s, Running things was precisely what his mother needed him to do. The evidence exists in the ledgers, fragmentary as they are. Theatre receipts, meant to cover productions, salaries, and repairs, were repeatedly diverted towards settling Maurice's private losses at the tables. It happened at the Porte Saint-Martin Theatre in the mid-1880s. It would happen again, more severely, at the Grand Théâtre Sarah Bernhardt after 1899. Sarah paid. She pawned jewels. She toured relentlessly, in part, biographers note, to refill coffers her son had helped empty. What did his family not fully know? The extent of it, likely, the precise sums, the precise frequency. What his young wife knew when she married him in the coming years. What his daughters understood as children watching their grandmother's fortune ebb and flow around their father's habits, is harder to reconstruct. What survives is the pattern, not the private confessions. There is a particular kind of loneliness in being financially rescued by the same woman who once ran into a burning building for you. Each bailout was, in its way, proof of love. Each bailout was also, quietly, proof that he had never quite been allowed, or perhaps never quite dared, to stand entirely on his own. By 1887, Maurice would attempt something that looked, for a while, like stability of his own making. He would marry. It happened inside a theatre that no longer exists in the form it did then. On a specific winter in Paris, few remember with precision, but the facts of the collapse are not in dispute. The Ambigu, refurbished at enormous expense for de Mahler's ill-fated stage career, closed its doors under Maurice's nominal direction within a single season. Fedora had run for 50 performances, 400,000 francs, gone. The theatre itself had to be surrendered. By February of 1883, Sarah stood at a public auction, watching her own jewellery, carriages, and horses sold off to cover a wound that was not, in any real sense, hers to have caused. Picture the room, the auctioneer's gavel, the most famous actress in the world, standing among strangers, bidding on her pearls, because her 19-year-old son had been handed a theatre he was never equipped to run, in service of a marriage that was already collapsing around a morphine addiction no one yet fully understood the shape of. Maurice's response, in the immediate aftermath, was quiet. There are no surviving letters of protest, no dramatic confrontation recorded by his mother's many biographers. He simply stepped back, and the family moved forward, as it always would, absorbing the loss and continuing. Somewhere inside this collapse sits a detail that will not make full sense for several more years yet. A loan, an obligation, a debt of loyalty that would eventually surface again in an entirely different context, tied not to money this time, but to a name, Dreyfus. Hold on to that. It returns. You need to sit with what this moment actually was, for a young man barely out of his teens. You have likely watched someone you love clean up a mess that was never entirely theirs to have made. A parent covering for a sibling, a friend absorbing a cost that should have been shared. Imagine that dynamic playing out not once in private, but publicly, at auction, with the entire city of Paris reading about it in the newspapers the following morning. The public humiliation belonged to his mother. The quieter humiliation, the daily knowledge that he had been trusted with something and had lost it, belonged to Maurice. He did not run from Paris. He did not disappear, as his father once had. He stayed, took a smaller role managing the Porte Saint-Martin Theatre the following year, and kept going. But something had shifted. The 18-year-old who had once stood at the head of a theatre with his mother's full confidence behind him would spend the rest of his life being managed, watched, and rescued, rather than simply trusted. Here is the part that no biography of Sarah Bernhardt has ever fully explained: what her son actually did day to day in the years after the Ambigu collapse. Publicly, Maurice re-entered respectable theatrical life. He took on the management of the Porte Saint-Martin Theatre through 1884. He began, quietly, to write plays with titles like Hécube and La Mort de Cléopâtre, works that drew on classical tragedy, ambitious in scope, largely unsuccessful in execution. None of his ventures, as writer or as manager, matched even a fraction of his mother's success. He kept trying anyway. Privately, household staff and family friends observed a young man building what might be called a parallel inner world, one defined less by artistic ambition than by an increasingly compulsive relationship with risk. The card tables, the private clubs, a taste, biographers note, for fencing as well, a discipline that at least channeled some of that same appetite for danger into something structured and controlled. There is a particular kind of behavior that emerges in children raised inside overwhelming theatrical love, a need to manufacture stakes of their own, because so much has already been handled, softened, and rescued by someone else. Maurice had been pulled from a fire as an infant. He had been handed a theatre at 18. He had watched his mother's jewels sold at public auction to cover his failure. What remained, for a young man in his 20s, was the gambling table, one of the only arenas left where the outcome was genuinely uncertain, where he alone bore the consequence, win or lose. This period also marks the quiet beginning of a family pattern that would recur across 2 more generations. Children raised, in significant part, not by their own parent, but by Sarah Bernhardt herself, the towering figure at the centre of the family's gravity. It had not fully emerged yet in 1885, but the shape of it, grandmother as primary caregiver, father as a loved but unreliable presence, was already forming in the architecture of the household. By 1887, at the age of 22, Maurice did something that suggested, for the first time, an attempt to build a life independent of his mother's stage and his mother's money. He fell in love with a Polish princess. This one was not financial. It was ideological, and it cut deeper than money ever had. In 1894, a French Jewish artillery officer named Alfred Dreyfus was convicted of treason on evidence that would, within a few years, be exposed as forged. The Dreyfus affair split French society down the middle, not simply a legal case, but a referendum on anti-Semitism, nationalism, and the soul of the Republic itself. Sarah Bernhardt, alongside Émile Zola and Victorien Sardou, became one of France's most visible defenders of Dreyfus's innocence. A conservative newspaper ran a headline accusing her, by name, of having joined the Jews against the army. It was, for a woman who had spent decades navigating anti-Semitic caricature over her own Jewish heritage, both a personal and a public reckoning. Her own son took the opposite side. Maurice believed Dreyfus was guilty. This was not the first time collapse had struck this family, but it was different in one crucial way. The 1883 disaster at the Ambigu had been something done to Sarah by circumstance, absorbed by her without complaint. This time, the wound came directly from her own son, publicly, over a matter of conscience rather than money. He refused to speak to her for a year. Picture what that silence must have meant inside a household built, from the very beginning, around one unbroken current of devotion. A mother who had run into fire for him, who had sold her jewellery for him, who had handed him theatres she could ill afford to lose. And now, the one thing he withheld from her was not forgiveness for a debt. It was his voice. Newspapers of the period, hungry for any crack in the Bernhardt myth, took quiet notice of the family rift, though Sarah herself said little publicly about her son's position. Privately, those close to the household understood it as the deepest estrangement mother and son ever experienced. Then, as the true facts of the Dreyfus frame-up emerged over the following years, and as France itself began to reckon with what had been done to an innocent man, the silence between Maurice and his mother ended. Reconciliation came. It always did in this family. But he had made a choice. The first fully independent, adult choice of his life. Made not for money, not out of gambling desperation, but out of genuine belief. And it happened to be the one choice that put him at odds with the woman who had built his entire existence. Perhaps that was not a coincidence. The specific trigger was that headline, "Sarah Bernhardt has joined the Jews against the army." It ran in a conservative Paris paper in the mid-1890s, at the height of the Dreyfus controversy, and it did what such headlines are designed to do. It turned a legal case into a referendum on loyalty, identity, and belonging. Sarah's response was to stand more firmly beside Zola and the Dreyfusard cause, regardless of personal cost. She had faced anti-Semitic mobs before, in Kiev and Odessa during her Russian tours. Crowds had thrown stones at her carriage during a period of active pogroms. She was not a woman easily frightened into silence. Her son's public alignment against Dreyfus, whatever his private reasoning, placed him on the same side as the newspaper that had attacked his own mother by name. What the press was mocking, and what conservative Paris was applauding, was never really about a single artillery officer's guilt or innocence. The real secret, buried beneath the politics, was something closer to home. A grown man, 30 years old, still financially dependent on his mother, still managing theatres she had built, still living inside the architecture of her fame, finally taking a public stand that was entirely, unmistakably his own, even if it meant standing against her. It is worth asking whether the position itself mattered as much as the act of dissent. A son who had never been allowed to fail on his own terms, who had been rescued from every fire, literal and financial, finally found one arena where he could not be rescued, corrected, or managed by his mother's intervention, his own conscience. The family's response, when it came, was neither loud denunciation nor immediate forgiveness. It was silence, a full year of it, an estrangement that outlasted most of the family's other crises combined, longer than the fallout from the ambigu, longer than any of Maurice's gambling debts had ever kept mother and son apart. Eventually, as history vindicated Dreyfus and France began its slow process of reckoning, the silence broke. Mother and son found their way back to each other, as this family always seemed to. But something had been proven in that year of silence that no fire, no auction, no gambling debt had ever proven before. Maurice Bernhardt was capable of holding a position his mother could not simply pay off, rescue, or absorb. By 1899, Sarah Bernhardt had signed a 25-year lease on a theatre at the Place du Châtelet, renaming it, with characteristic confidence, the Théâtre Sarah Bernhardt. She was 55 years old, and she intended to run it herself, down to the lighting and the costumes, for as long as she possibly could. Maurice, now in his mid-30s, settled into the role that would define the rest of his working life. Not an independent artist, not a separate man of business, but his mother's manager, agent, and, eventually, successor. He arranged her foreign tours across Europe and the Americas. He handled logistics for a theatrical operation of extraordinary scale. Costumes, transport, contracts. An aging star who refused to stop working even after catastrophic financial losses, even after the debts he himself had helped create. It was, in its way, a return to the beginning. The boy pulled from a fire because he was the one thing worth saving, had grown into a man whose entire adult identity remained organized around protecting and sustaining that same irreplaceable figure. Remember the fire from the beginning of this story? Here is what it means. A child rescued that dramatically, that absolutely, rarely learns that his own survival might one day depend on standing entirely apart from the person who saved him. Maurice never truly left his mother's orbit, not through the theatre collapses of his 20s, not through the year of silence over Dreyfus, not through his own marriage, his own children, his own creative ambitions as a playwright that never quite found an audience beyond the shadow of her name. He remained useful to her, and she remained, in every meaningful financial and emotional sense, essential to him. This is not, it should be said, a simple story of exploitation. Those close to the family describe genuine devotion running in both directions. A mother who indulged her son shamelessly because she loved him without reservation, and a son who managed her chaos not out of obligation alone, but because the bond between them, despite every collapse, remained, as one biographer put it, as unyielding as iron. But devotion and independence are not the same thing, and by the turn of the century, with a wife and 2 young daughters of his own, now depending on him, Maurice Bernhardt would discover exactly how difficult it was to build something that was entirely, separately his. Her name was Maria Teresa Wirginia Klotylda Jablonowska. Everyone who knew her called her Terka. She was a Polish princess, born in 1863, 1 year older than Maurice, and, unusually for a woman of her aristocratic background, a working painter in her own right. They married in Paris on the 29th of December, 1887, at the 16th Arrondissement's registry office, when Maurice was 22 years old. For the first time in his adult life, Maurice had built something that existed outside his mother's theatres, outside her debts, outside her fame. A marriage, a household. In 1889, Terka gave birth to their first daughter, Simone. 7 years later, in 1896, came a second daughter, Ligne. What Terka gave Maurice was something no theatre directorship, no gambling win, no reconciliation with his famous mother had ever fully provided: the experience of being the centre of a family rather than an extension of one. He travelled with her. He built a life around fatherhood that, whatever its financial chaos, appears to have been genuinely warm. Biographers describe him embracing the role of husband and father with real commitment, even as his gambling continued to strain the household. What it cost him would not become clear until 1910. Terka Jablonowska died young, at the age of roughly 47, leaving Maurice a widower with 2 daughters, Simone, 21, and already engaged to be married, and Ligne, only 14 years old. There is a short, brutal fact worth sitting with here. A girl of 14, having just lost her mother, was taken in not primarily by her father, but by her 70-year-old grandmother, a woman still touring the world, still performing, still, remarkably, capable of absorbing one more life into the gravitational pull of her own. Maurice, at 45, found himself once again inside the same pattern that had shaped his own childhood. A family reorganizing itself around Sarah Bernhardt, rather than around him. He did not resist it. Perhaps, by then, he understood it as simply how his family survived loss. His mother had once run into fire to save him. Now she opened her door, without hesitation, to save his daughter. The marriage that had briefly given Maurice a life of his own ended in a hospital room, and the daughter it had produced was folded, once again, into the world of the divine Sarah. Simone Bernhardt, the elder daughter, chose the quieter path. In September of 1909, at Versailles, she married a man named Edgar Gross, the son of a wealthy Philadelphia soap manufacturer, stepping deliberately away from the theatrical world that had consumed 3 generations of her family. She lived, by most accounts, an unremarkable and largely private life, eventually raising 2 children of her own, a son and a daughter. One of those grandchildren carries a small, almost novelistic footnote worth including. Simone's daughter, known within the family as Turquette, would go on to marry, among her several marriages, a man named Pierre Clemenceau, grandson of Georges Clemenceau, the French wartime prime minister, sometimes called the Tiger of France. A family that began with an actress and a Belgian prince's discarded affair had, within 3 generations, threaded itself into the bloodline of one of France's most consequential political dynasties. Lyciane's path stayed closer to the flame. Raised largely by her grandmother from the age of 14, she grew up inside the theatrical world her father had never quite escaped either. She would later marry the playwright Louis Verneuil, and, in 1949, more than 2 decades after Sarah Bernhardt's death, she would publish a memoir titled Sarah Bernhardt, My Grandmother, a document that would become one of the more intimate surviving windows into the private life of the family, written not by Maurice, and not by Sarah herself, but by the granddaughter who had been folded into the household after her own mother's death. There is a generational pattern here, worth naming plainly. Maurice had been raised largely under his mother's direct influence, cared for as much by her household staff and companions as by any conventional nuclear family structure. His own daughter, Lyciane, was raised the same way, not primarily by her father, but by her grandmother, after loss struck the household a second time. What Maurice received from his own upbringing, he did not choose to pass down so much as he simply repeated it, reshaped by circumstance rather than by intention. It was never rejection. His daughters, by every surviving account, remained devoted to him and to their grandmother alike. But the architecture of the family, one towering, all-absorbing central figure, with fathers and sons orbiting at a respectful, dependent distance, proved remarkably difficult to break. By the time the First World War arrived, that towering figure was approaching 70 years old, and the family was about to be tested in ways none of them had yet faced. The specific trigger of Maurice's decline cannot be pointed to as a single diagnosis or a single market crash. It was slower than that, a long accumulation of debt, responsibility, and diminishing returns that stretched across the final decades of his life. In 1915, his mother's right leg was amputated, the result of a knee injury sustained years earlier during a performance in Rio de Janeiro that had never properly healed. Maurice, by then in his 50s, stood beside her through the surgery and the wartime years that followed, as she refused prosthetics, refused a wheelchair, and insisted on being carried in a specially designed sedan chair so she could continue performing for soldiers near the front lines of the First World War. He managed what remained manageable: the theatre, the finances, such as they were. His own gambling debts continued to surface periodically throughout these years, still settled, when possible, by his mother's continued earnings, even as she pawned jewels and continued relentless touring into her 70s to keep the enterprise afloat. The physical details of where this left the family are worth stating plainly. A woman past 70, missing a leg, still selling out theatres and touring American cities under actual threat of German submarine attack in 1916. A son in his 50s, still managing her affairs, still without a major independent success of his own to his name, having buried a wife 6 years earlier and raised 2 daughters largely under his mother's roof. What Maurice kept throughout this long decline was the one thing that had defined him from childhood: his position beside her, not ahead of her, not independent of her, beside her. On the 26th of March, 1923, at 8 in the evening, Sarah Bernhardt died. Newspaper accounts of the time reported that she died peacefully, without suffering, in the arms of her son. He was 58 years old. For the first time in his life, there was no one left standing between him and the full weight of the name Bernhardt. He inherited the Théâtre Sarah Bernhardt. He inherited its debts, its expectations, and its ghosts. He became its director, a role he had, in some form, already been rehearsing since he was 18 years old, and first handed a theatre he was not ready to run. This time, there would be no one left to bail him out. Return, for a moment, to that evening in March of 1923, 8 o'clock. A room in the house on Boulevard Pereire, in Paris's 17th arrondissement, the home Sarah had bought, with fortune earned from her world tours after rebuilding from earlier bankruptcies. She had been preparing, weeks earlier, to appear in a new film despite her failing kidneys, telling journalists she was being paid 10,000 francs a day and was, quite simply, ready to work regardless of the cost to her body. She never made it to filming. Maurice was there at the end. So, reportedly, was a specially arranged telephone line, a theatrophone, through which she had insisted on following live performances even from her deathbed, unwilling, until the very last possible moment, to be anywhere but connected to the stage. Almost 500,000 Parisians lined the streets for her funeral procession, an outpouring of public grief France had rarely offered anyone, let alone an actress. Now move forward 5 years, to December of 1928, and to Maurice's own final days, recorded with far less fanfare, in far fewer newspapers, in a city that had already begun to treat the Bernhardt name as history rather than headline. He died on the 21st of December, one day before his 64th birthday. The Théâtre Sarah Bernhardt, which he had directed since his mother's death, was, in that very same year, hosting one of the most celebrated premieres of the era. Sergei Diaghilev's Ballet Russe, staging Igor Stravinsky's Apollon Musaget on its stage that June. The theatre his mother built, and his own management had struggled to sustain, was still, at the moment of his death, glittering with a prestige that had somehow always managed to eclipse him. He was buried at Père Lachaise Cemetery, in the same family plot as his mother, Division 44, a resting place that has drawn visitors for a century, most of whom come to see her name, not his. There is a detail that returns here, quietly, from the very beginning of this story. The boy his mother once dressed in fine clothing, kept his hair long, presented to Paris as something almost ornamental. He remained, by every account of those who knew him in his final decades, an elegant man, a dandy. One biographer called him charm, masking the vulnerabilities underneath, poise that never quite left him even as fortune repeatedly did. The costume she placed on him as a child, in one sense, never fully came off. The Théâtre Sarah Bernhardt kept its founder's name for over a decade after Maurice's death, until the German occupation of Paris during the Second World War, when authorities forced a renaming to the Théâtre de la Cité, stripped of its association with a Jewish family whose heritage had once made Sarah herself a target of anti-Semitic caricature even at the height of her fame. The name would not be fully restored until 1947, and the building would change names several more times before settling, in 1968, into its present identity as the Théâtre de la Ville. Maurice's estate passed to his 2 daughters. Simone, already settled into private life with her husband and children in America and France, largely stepped away from the theatrical world her grandmother had built. Ligne, the daughter raised inside Sarah's household from the age of 14, carried the family's story forward in the most literal way available to her. She wrote it down. In 1949, more than 2 decades after her father's death and 26 years after her grandmother's, Ligne published Sarah Bernhardt, My Grandmother, a memoir offering a granddaughter's intimate account of the household, the myth, and the private man who had raised her after her mother's early death. It remains one of the few surviving first-hand family accounts of what life actually looked like inside the Bernhardt orbit, away from the posters and the headlines. Here, then, is the payoff of the third detail promised at the start of this story, that single year of silence between Maurice and his mother over the Dreyfus affair. It has often been treated, in passing references across a century of Bernhardt biographies, as a minor footnote, a brief political disagreement, quickly resolved, but set against everything else this family survived together: the fire, the auction jewellery, the gambling debts paid and paid again, the collapsed marriages, the early death of a wife. It stands out as the only rupture in Maurice Bernhardt's entire life that his mother's money, fame, or devotion could not immediately repair. Everything else about their relationship could be rescued. That, for 1 year, could not. Decades later, archival researchers combing through the Paris civil registries would confirm details that popular biographies had long gotten wrong or simply omitted. The precise date of his marriage to Teresa, buried in a registry office record from the 16th arrondissement, quietly correcting a century of imprecise retelling. The theatre outlived him, the name outlived the theatre, and the son, for the most part, simply faded from the story his mother had spent 60 years writing. For most of the 20th century, Maurice Bernhardt existed in his mother's biographies almost entirely as a supporting problem to be managed. The gambling son, the financial drain, the disappointment measured against a woman whose talent and ambition seemed to defy the very concept of limitation. Even sympathetic accounts tend to mention him primarily in terms of the debts he generated and the theatres he mismanaged. What the archival record, marriage registries, death certificates, cemetery documentation, and the private testimony preserved in his own daughter's memoir actually shows is a more complicated man than that shorthand allows. He was not simply a wastrel. He was a working playwright, however unsuccessful, who kept attempting to create something of his own, inside a shadow no amount of effort could fully escape. He was a theatre manager, handed enormous responsibility at 18 years old, with no training and no margin for error, by a mother whose confidence in him consistently outpaced his preparation. He was a husband who appears, by the surviving evidence, to have built a genuinely loving household with Teresa Jablonowska before losing her far too young. He was a father who, whatever his financial failures, raised 2 daughters who remained devoted to him and to his memory throughout their own long lives. What the press of his era, and much of the biographical tradition that followed, called weakness was, in a more clinical reading, something closer to a lifelong condition of dependency, engineered not through malice, but through overwhelming love. A boy saved once, dramatically from fire, and then saved again, and again, and again, financially, professionally, socially, rarely develops the tools to save himself, because he is never truly required to. The most quietly devastating detail to emerge from Ligne's 1949 memoir is not a scandal or a revelation of hidden wrongdoing. It is simply the portrait of an ordinary, affectionate grandfather figure existing behind the myth. A man who dressed elegantly, doted on his granddaughter, and carried, beneath the poise, the accumulated exhaustion of a lifetime, spent standing just outside the spotlight of the single most famous woman in the world. What the newspapers of 1883 called failure, and what the newspapers of 1894 called betrayal, were, in fact, the same thing seen from two different angles. A man trying, imperfectly and repeatedly, to become someone independent of the fire that had once saved him. This is not a story about the son of a superstar, after all. It never was. It is a story about what it costs to be loved so completely that you are never quite required to become anyone else. Return to that room in Paris, December of 1928. A man, 3 days from what would have been his 64th birthday, dressed, even now, with the same careful elegance his mother once arranged for him as a small boy, with long, uncut hair and clothing chosen to please a Parisian audience that had not yet even learned his name. The costume was never really about vanity. It was about visibility on someone else's terms, a child styled to be looked at, admired, protected, and, ultimately, never quite released to define himself entirely on his own. Go back further still, to 1868, to the smoke and the flame, and the 24-year-old actress who ran back into a burning apartment and came out holding nothing but her son. That fire is the beginning and the end of this entire story. It proved, in the most absolute way one human being can prove anything to another, that he mattered more to her than everything she owned. And it also meant that for the rest of his life, he would never quite have to prove he could survive without her. So how does a boy who was the one thing his mother ever risked everything to save end up dying in relative obscurity, 1 day short of 64, in the shadow of a theatre that carried her name and not his own? Not through cruelty, not through neglect, through the opposite, through a love so complete, so absolute, so endlessly forgiving of every collapsed theatre and every gambling debt and every failed play, that independence simply never became necessary. He built a marriage and lost it early to illness. He raised 2 daughters who loved him. He took one true stand of his own over Dreyfus, and it cost him a year of his mother's voice. The only cost, in 63 years, that neither of them could simply pay their way out of. He inherited her theatre. He could not outrun her name. Neither, in the end, has history. She gave him everything: a home rebuilt from ashes, a life free of consequence, a fortune spent and respent on his behalf, 60 years of devotion that never once wavered, even when he gave her every reason to walk away. What it cost him was the one thing that money, fame, and love together could never purchase for him: the chance to find out, entirely on his own, who Maurice Bernhardt might have been. He was saved from the fire. He never quite got to save himself.